Hi there, everyone. Emer Burke here. Welcome to our second online Mount Haemus series. And for those of you who don't know, Mount Haemus is part of it's one of the three strands of the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, where we offer an award for scholarly work, thanks to our patron, Dwena Murphy-Gibbs. And this is I suppose we started this in 2000, and so this is our 23rd Mount Haemus, our 23rd year. Every 4 years, we used to meet in person and have a Mount Haemus Day where four scholars would present their paper, and we should have had our last one into 2020, but because of the pandemic, we couldn't. So we've been very, very fortunate that we've had 4 American presenters. So we had 2 last week and 2 this evening. And I hope you very much enjoy that. And we will also have a physical one where we have other 4 presentations in October of this year. So over to our first speaker, Larisa White.
Well, good morning to those who are in my time zone, and good evening to those of you farther east, and good very early morning to my friends from New Zealand, who I know got up very early to be here today. I need to move. I'm sorry, I'm having some trouble with the interface here. Just get this set. Beautiful. All right. Today I'll be presenting a few of the findings from the World Druidry Survey, which was a sociological study I conducted between 2018 and 2021 that explored and examined the ways in which the modern spiritual tradition of Druidry is actually practiced by Druids across the world. There are many how-to books currently in print and some wonderful Druid orders with great curricula that help guide new Druids along their developing spiritual paths, but there hadn't yet been a lot of research done into what the actual beliefs and real life practices of Druids was like across the world. And so the World Druidry Survey was designed to try to fill that research gap. So as we all know, modern Druidry is a nature reverent spiritual tradition, and it was derived from and inspired by the landscapes and seasonal cycles, agricultural calendars, and folk traditions of Northwestern Europe in general, Britain in particular. But that tradition has now spread across the globe. Modern Druids can now be found residing in dozens of different countries across the world. If you take a look at the little red dots, that's each dot is one of the countries in which Druids currently live. And according to the census data that was available at the time of the study, there were somewhere between 60 and 100,000 practicing Druids across the world, with more than 10 times as many Druids living outside of Europe as in it. So for me, this led to 3 really important questions, research questions. First, how can a nature-based spiritual tradition that's born in Northwestern Europe continue to make sense when transported to vastly different landscapes and climates? Second, what, if anything, changes as Druidry spreads to countries and cultures where the customs and folk traditions and the myths and the agricultural calendars are so different? And finally, what, if anything, forms I would say, the common core of modern Druidry, which can unite Druids across the world, despite any variations that there might be in local practice? To answer these questions, in 2018, I organized the first large-scale international survey of modern Druidry. The questionnaire for the study was developed in consultation with leaders from OBOD, but also from the British Druid Order, the Druid Network, the Ancient Order of Druids in America, ADF, and an assortment of solitary Druids from around the world, to ensure that the questions themselves would not bias anything by my own personal experience of Druidry. In its final form, the survey included 189 questions, including 18 open-ended essay questions. So this was an enormous survey. It asked Druids about their physical, social, and cultural environments, about their theological beliefs, their ritual and devotional practices, their celebrated holidays, and the factors that had influenced their development as Druids. And it also included a variety of demographic data so that after the fact, I could slice and dice the data set and check to make sure there wasn't any self-selection bias in the results. To ensure that the findings would fairly represent all Druids across the world, unbiased by ease of contact or by Druid group affiliation, the study was announced really widely, and it encouraged participation from as many Druids as possible, from as many countries as possible, and as many Druid groups as possible. Initially, I thought this might lead to 60 or 100 people doing the thing across the world, because who would ever do a survey this large, right? I don't know that I would. But 725 Druids completed the entire survey. About 1,000 began the process and couldn't make it all the way through. But this is an astonishing response rate, given the number of questions and the amount of time required to complete the questionnaire. The responses that I got came in from 34 nations across 6 continents. There were Druids representing 147 different Druid groups, and I had no idea there were even that many groups in the world. It also represented 131 unaffiliated solitary practitioners and a diverse population of Druids along lines of age, gender, ethnic identity, years of experience with Druidry, and the cultural and ecological context of their practice. So altogether, these Druids wrote over 1,500 single-spaced pages of first-person narratives about their beliefs and practices. And they provided over 120,000 quantitative checkbox responses. So this is like the largest data set that exists right now on the beliefs, practices, and lived experiences of contemporary world Druids. So as we consider the results of the survey coming, and as surprising as some of these results may be, because they surprised me too, it's important to keep in mind that the results are not based on any of my personal opinions or theories, but just on a rigorous analysis of data and what is found in that data set. So I'm going to talk briefly about how one analyzes this kind of data set. I use what's called a mixed methods approach for the analysis. So it looks at both the quantitative and the qualitative data by techniques appropriate to each, and then uses some statistical tools to combine them to tease out some more detail. So the quantitative checkbox responses were just tallied, and the data counts were presented as graphics in the final report. And that part's fairly straightforward. It's what most of us think of when we think of survey results. But in a mixed methods analysis, that's just the first step. So we next have to consider the qualitative data. The responses to the essay questions were each read multiple times and gradually coded for conceptual content, which means each essay was labeled with a set of code words that identified particular ideas or themes that were evident in that response. And then the computer would go through and count the number of essays from the number of respondents labeled with each code. So those code counts were then reported in the final results, along with sort of thick descriptions of the types of responses that fell into each category, and an assortment of pull quotes from the essays that illustrated the themes, so that you can kind of get a feel for what people actually said, not just hearing my summary of it. So now we've got the qualitative and quantitative data separately analyzed. And this is where the fun for me began, because what I did is I took all the quantitative data counts and the qualitative code counts and entered them into a giant database, and then cross-tabulated all of that data in hundreds of different combinations to tease out the universal themes and global variations in the beliefs and practices of modern Druids. So the statistical tool I used for this is called a chi-square test. And for the non-statisticians, this is a mathematical test that calculates the probability that an apparent difference between groups might just be due to random variations in the data, as opposed to a significant difference that means something's really different between the two groups. And usually in sociology, the certainty that you can apply to these tests is not very high, but the World Druidry data set turned out to be so large that I could use a p-value of 0.01 for the study, which means any statistically significant differences, we can be at least 99% certain that there is a real difference between the Druid subgroups. And so there's got to be something real happening there with 99% certainty. So all of this, the results and the surveys and the analysis went into this gigantic book that has it all. But today I'll be focusing in on just one small piece of that, the seasonal celebrations in a globalizing tradition. As time is short, so let's get to the starting place we're all familiar with. So as practicing Druids, we've all seen this before, the traditional Wheel of the Year. The Eightfold Year, it's taught in pretty much all the Druid curricula. It appears in all the beginning level how-to books on Druidry. And it's a cycle of seasonal celebrations with a story that goes something like this. The year traditionally begins at Samhain, when the first hard frost of the year sends the flora and fauna into winter hibernation. It's traditionally a time to honor the dead, ancestors of blood, spirit, and place. At the winter solstice, we celebrate the rebirth of the sun on the longest, darkest night of the year with rituals of reclaiming light in the darkness. Yes? So at Imbolc, we celebrate the first signs of returning life after winter. When snowdrops push up out of the frozen earth, new lambs are born, we focus on spiritual renewal in anticipation of the coming spring. At the vernal equinox, we celebrate the start of spring, the fleeting moment of balance when daylight finally triumphs over darkness. Druids, traditionally, they sow seeds for their gardens at this time. They sow seeds of projects of the hands and heart for the season, right? So it's a seed planting time. At Beltane, we celebrate the rapid regreening of the land when hawthorns and apple trees are in blossom, and Druids celebrate life, love, passion, and vibrant new growth at that time. At the summer solstice, we celebrate the peak power of the sun, the time of warmth and abundant flowers, herb harvests, and ripening berries. Lunasa marks the start of the wheat harvest, right? It's a time for bread baking and cider making when Druids begin to harvest the fruits of their year's works. At the autumn equinox, we celebrate the start of autumn when the fruit and nut trees offer up their bounty, the leaves take on autumn colors and begin to drop. And it's often considered a time of Thanksgiving and a time to prepare for winter, which arrives with the return of Samhain. But according to the results of the World Druidry Survey, only 47% of world Druids celebrate all 8 of these festivals as taught in the books and curricula. 26% celebrate a subset of them, and 27% of Druids across the world do not celebrate any of them. And this really surprised me. I wanted to know why, because this is the easy bit, right? Of all the things we learn as Druids, this is the festivals, the celebrations, this is the fun part. So why do so few really celebrate them? And the why questions, or we're having the essay questions, really come in handy. So Druids around the world wrote reams of material describing exactly what festivals they celebrated, when they celebrated them, how they celebrated them, and the reasons why. 76% of world Druids use the Wheel of the Year primarily as a reminder to go outside and connect with nature. And these are some of the kinds of things that they wrote. I'm not sure if the festivals have specific spiritual meaning to me. Rather, they mark the passage of time through the seasons and through life. They are how I connect with the natural world and recognize I'm a part of it. I prefer to live and work more closely attuned to my immediate environment. I often find that spontaneous, informal rituals, usually going outdoors and noting some sign of the season, is more meaningful to me than following a script. The meaning or intention is to draw myself into harmony with the cycles of the natural world. So it seems that what most Druids take away from their studies of the Wheel of the Year is not so much the specific detail of the traditional celebrations as the meta lessons about the importance of nature observation, nature connection, and using the metaphors of the seasons to guide spiritual and emotional growth. The reason behind the lack of participation in traditional Wheel of the Year celebrations becomes apparent if we consider again the map of where world druids currently live. While many, not most, but many druids do live in ecological systems that mirror the seasonal cycles of Northwestern Europe, many also live in ecological systems that are completely different, such as arid scrublands and woodlands with Mediterranean climates, or deserts, or humid subtropical areas, or temperate or tropical rainforests. These biomes are not simply four-season environments that are a bit warmer or a bit cooler, or simply reversed because they're in the southern hemisphere. Those in the tropics lack strong cycles of light and darkness because there are roughly 12 hours of daylight all year round. Many places where druids live now never experience a frost or a winter hibernation period. Many are driven by cycles of precipitation and drought and might have more than 4 seasons to consider. The traditional Wheel of the Year calendar and symbols map really well to the seasons and flora and fauna characteristic of temperate deciduous forest biomes, mostly found in Europe. They partially map to seasons in slightly colder or warmer 4-season biomes if the festivals are shifted a bit in time to accommodate the difference in when the seasons actually arrive. And this was evident in the data that many people take that Wheel of the Year, but then just shift it. But the traditional symbols and timing of this festivals have little or no relevance to those in biomes defined by seasonal variations in precipitation and drought, rather than changes in light and temperature. And I'm going to share a few excerpts from Druid survey responses to where they describe their local seasons to illustrate this. From the American Southwest, we have this. We have 5 seasons in the Sonoran Desert. The 4-summer drought in May and June is exceedingly hot and dry, but the saguaros bloom. Then come the summer monsoons and explosive thunderstorms and haboobs. A haboob here is a desert sandstorm. Some wildflowers bloom with the temporary water, almost like a second spring. When the dryness returns and the air begins to cool, fall is in the season and the backyard begins to grow. The winter monsoon brings gentle rains and our garden flourishes. Spring warms up the desert again gradually, and palo verdes and wildflowers bloom. In Kenya, spring is in the wet seasons, of which there are 2. In both cases, the seasons are driven by rain, not sun. That is the biggest difference to Europe. And from Australia, Mediterranean climate. This makes the onset of winter like spring, when flowers occur and things become green. Wheat is planted and grows over winter. Very different. So what do druids do in places that are so different? My first guess would be that these would be the druids least likely to celebrate the Wheel of the Year. But again, the survey data proved me wrong. While only 47% of druids across the world celebrate the 8-fold year, as we learn it in all of the studies, there were certain subgroups that were more likely to do so. OBA did a better job, 53%, so there's something to be said of the curriculum and the teachings here, but that wasn't the most. 55% of druids that focused on spiritual nature connection also celebrated 8 festivals. So these are people that spent time meditating on the metaphors of the seasons as presented in their books and curricula, and then went out in search of local symbols that would correspond with those metaphors. 60% of druids who focused on detailed nature observations, this is just scientific nature observations here, 60% of them celebrated an 8-fold Wheel of the Year, but they didn't necessarily celebrate the same one. The festivals were likely to be something different. 62% of druids who focused on what I call spiritual wildcrafting, this is a term that was actually coined by Gordon Cooper some years ago, celebrate an 8-fold year, and again, not necessarily the same one. And I'll be discussing spiritual wildcrafting in a moment, but I just want to point out that the differences in these numbers might seem small percentage-wise, but the differences between the subgroups were statistically significant. And so there is something real going on here again. And so to find out the why, we go back to the essays. When Druids living in different ecological regions described their approach to the Wheel of the Year, they wrote about a kind of spiritual wildcrafting as indicated in these quotes. The wheel is focused on the traditional 4 seasons, which don't map with my climate. I've slowly been trying to develop my own wheel with celebrations tied to my work in the garden and landscape, recognizing the changes that I see through the year. I celebrate weather-related firsts. By that I mean the first thunder of spring, first buds, first mud after frozen ground, first turn of the leaves, first frost, first snow, that sort of thing. I don't think my symbolism is particularly novel. Growth, change, letting go, birth, death, rebirth at various levels. And this one. I rewrote our Wheel of the Year and created new symbols and celebrations in accordance with the actual seasons where we live. We do observe most of the traditional symbolism of the Druid Wheel of the Year, but in a different order and at very different times of the year. According to the survey results, 52% of world Druids celebrate a cycle of seasonal celebrations that are wildcrafted from their local landscapes. What this means is that they begin with careful observations of their local landscape, climate, flora, and fauna, always watching for signs of the local seasons as evident in the local environment. They meditate on the spiritual symbolism that might be associated with the seasonal changes that they observe. Now, this is a process that's reversed from that spiritual nature connection category, right? In the spiritual nature connection, they start with the metaphors and go look for a symbol to put on top of that. Here, they look at nature first, read the metaphors in the natural world, and then figure out what the metaphors and symbolism could be to represent that. So the seasonal symbols, the spiritual metaphors, even the legends and folk traditions that these Druids incorporated into their rituals tend to be drawn from local sources. And they adapt their Wheels of the Year to celebrate what's actually happening in their local landscapes. Surprisingly, I found that this practice of spiritual wildcrafting happens not just in places with very different ecological systems, but also in some areas of Northwestern Europe and the British Isles where climate change has been accelerating or delaying the arrival of the seasonal changes. So what does this look like? I'm going to share with you just a few examples of what Druids around the world have been doing with their wildcrafted Wheels of the Year to give you a flavor for it. There are dozens and dozens of examples in the book, but we're kind of strapped for time, so we'll just quickly go through these. At the winter solstice, which is the most commonly celebrated of the eightfold wheel, we have this one is from Brazil, Season of Heart, winter solstice, end of June, time to seek shelter again. It's cold, windy, and raining too much to be outside. A time of harvest and hearth, to stand by and celebrate around the fire, and also to journey inward to seek the inner light that shines a path through the darkness. So cold and wet, of course, this comes from Brazil where cold is a relative term, but also this is a time of harvest. From another place in the Southern Hemisphere, we have this. Yule is in the height of summer, so activities that I traditionally associated with it aren't appropriate. So I made it an astronomical event. This is where the orbit is. This is the continuation of the cycle. At Imbolc, we have this in from the desert of the American Southwest. I'm making adjustments as needed. For Imbolc, I plan to shift to a focus on the winter monsoon and link that to purification, light, and water. And from a much colder four-season climate, we have this. I feel very detached from Imbolc here in Minnesota. Nothing grows amid a dead, frozen world, blanketed under 2 feet of snow. I associate Imbolc more with crafts and hobbies. my grove has scheduled a robe making party, and I'll be bringing my sewing machine and other supplies to participate. At the vernal equinox in New Zealand, we have this. In ancient Maori society, the rising of the star Aotahi, or Canopus, announced the arrival of spring, together with the flowering of kowhai, signifying the fish are getting fat and a sign for kumara planting to begin. And here kumara is the sweet potato, which is the staple crop of New Zealand rather than wheat. In Sweden, spring is celebrated with making a huge bonfire and singing from sunset and into the night. Prior to the spring equinox, we bring birch branches into the house and decorate them with colored feathers. At Beltane in the frozen north, Beltane usually involves some sort of baptism in the ice-cold river. It's celebrated when the apples blossom. But in New Zealand, we have a late arrival of spring at the time of Beltane. To the Maori, this was Whirinyanuku, the 5th month, when ka whakaniho ngā mea katoa o te whenua I kone. All things now put forth fresh growth. A good flowering of tikauka, the cabbage tree, is said to be a sign that a long, fine summer will follow. At the summer solstice, we begin to see even more pronounced variations in the focus of Druid seasonal celebrations. From the subtropics of the United States, we have this. I celebrate the sun at its height and the energies of joy and manifestation. I also often ask for protection from drought and hurricanes and flooding associated with this time of year. And in Sweden at midsummer, it sounds more like Beltane. Midsummer in Sweden, you dance. Often there are at least 2 to 3 circles around a pole that is very phallic and dressed in flowers and leaves. At night, maidens and bachelors pick 7, 9, or 11 different kinds of flowers, lay them under their pillow, and if they're lucky, they'll see their future spouse in a dream. At Lunasa, when most are thinking of harvests, the opposite is true in other parts of the world. For example, in the Maori cycle, the kumara, the sweet potato, is not yet harvested. In fact, far from being a time of plenty, it is Te Waru Patote, the lean month, when the staple crop is at its scarcest. And from California, we have this, which sounds very close to home here. Our rituals at this time are more mundane than symbolic. We refresh and restock all emergency supplies, pre-pack our bug-out bags for the fire season, review all emergency preparedness procedures, and set out water and food for the wildlife to help comfort them through the dying time. At the autumn equinox, this story continues. At this time of year, when wildfires and smoke blanket our landscape, the animals are dying of thirst and hunger, and all native plants are drought dormant. We observe our equivalent to the traditional Samhain. Meanwhile, down in Brazil, we have the old year, end of March, time to prepare, to care for the health of the house if a nose or roof is dripping, end of the dry and hot season and start of the rainy and cold one. Also, a time of activity. This is the time to plant seed and sapling on the ground, waiting for the rains to come. And finally, we come to Samhain, the traditional death of the year. We dance and sing to welcome the first measurable rains of the year, a joyous moment of rebirth as the danger of fire season is finally over. And in New Zealand, a beautiful localized extension of the traditional celebration. We invite the ancestors to our circle. We welcome the spirits of those who migrated from the savannah and all the subsequent migrations undertaken that brought us to be living in this blessed land of Aotearoa. While most Druids still celebrate through traditional festivals which make sense in their local environment, most also believe that honoring the beings who are actually present and celebrating what is actually happening in the local landscape is more important than following a written tradition. 76% of world Druids use the Wheel of the Year primarily as a cyclical reminder to go outside and connect with nature. That act of nature connection either reinforces and enriches the symbolism of the traditional wheel, or it inspires them to wildcraft their rituals and celebrations. Now, there are many differences in the wheels of the year that Druids actually celebrate across the world, but there is also a common core to those celebrations, the thing that unites us all. Druids celebrate moments in which hope is rekindled. That might be the moment of returning light at midwinter, or the time of the first thaw, or the first flower pushing up in spring. It might be the first rain after a drought, or the return of a life-giving monsoon. But whatever form that metaphor of hope takes in the natural world, Druids use that time to be inspired, to reawaken themselves to new possibilities, and to work to cultivate their inner spark of light. Druids celebrate times of planting, be it crops of the field or projects of the hands and heart. They bless their seeds and tools and soils, both physically and metaphorically. They prune away real and spiritual deadwood. They plant seeds and cultivate their projects and plantings to bring their harvests home. Druids celebrate moments when the earth offers up an abundance of unbidden blessings. That's usually when a perfect combination of light, moisture, and warmth makes the world explode in flowering fertility. Druids celebrate a multitude of harvests, vegetables, fruits, and grains from the garden, and also fruits of creative personal projects. They also share the bounty of their harvest with acts of charity in their wider communities, both with other humans and with other than humankinds. Druids observe moments when the living earth is dying or going dormant for a season. This might happen at the first hard frost, but it also happens at things like the start of wildfire seasons, right? At these times, Druids honor those who have lived and died and gone before. Finally, Druids observe and respond to the moments when nature dictates a time of rest and retreat for a fallow time of reflection and rejuvenation. The specific moments of celebration for each of these things varies, depending on careful observations of the natural world and a process of cultivating deep personal relationships with nature. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions. And if we are unable to get to them all today, please feel free to contact me at my website and I'll try to answer any remaining questions via email if we run out of time. So I'll turn this back over to Emer and thank you all for your time and attention.
Oh, thank you so much, Larisa. That was absolutely fascinating. Just that huge diversity within Druidry, and it's really heartening to hear of how Druids who aren't in this part of the world are actually making sense of their own landscape and really having that connection. So there's one connection, or I have a number of questions already, so I just want to get on so we won't waste time. Jennifer, how many Druids, did you ask a question or were you able to? How many Druids have been practicing Druidry all their life, and how many found Druidry, say, later in their life?
I can't speak to all their lives, but I can speak to sort of, there's a chart, let me try to pull it up in the book, of how long people have been practicing. I did ask, so let me grab. Go. Time practicing Druidry. We have anywhere from 40 years to less than a year. The majority really fall between 5 and 30 years. The majority of Druids between 5 and 30. So actually, no, that's not true. I'm looking at my data here and adding them up. Actually, the majority are 1 to 5 years. I split out those because there were so many. So it's about equal amounts between in 1 and 5 years and between 5 and 30 years. So It's growing. It's very much growing.
Great. Listen, thank you.
Yeah.
Another question from Jennifer as well. Which descriptions of the local traditions for the seasonal festivals did you find most extraordinary or most touching?
I have to say, after I finished the analysis, I wanted to pick up my bags and move to New Zealand to be a druid in New Zealand. The most amazing, creative ways of dealing with the environment and learning from the Maori culture, which fortunately they still have, vibrantly there. That it inspired me the most. Actually, all of Oceania had a lot of really interesting things.
That I understand. Philip, Stephanie, and I were there in 2019, and I was blown away how Obad Druids and wove in Maori tradition, but also the landscape. I thought, wow, I was so impressed.
They've got their own tree-ogum there, and
Right,
it's magnificent.
Brilliant. There's a question from Liz. Did you find any druids speaking more to perennial gardening, agriculture, rather than annual permaculture, forest gardening, etc.? Wouldn't be planting springs in a perennial culture?
Druids did a whole bunch of different things in local gardens, and a lot of that depended on where they lived and what access they had to land. So the people did everything from little vegetable gardens on their balconies in the cities to food forest restoration. So there was a wide range of different things, and usually they did what they were able to do. And the limitations seemed less a matter of philosophy and more a matter of, do I own the land that am I allowed really to do that?
Okay, thank you. Sean has a question. Do you envision, now this is an interesting one, do you envision revisiting the study or survey questions after a period of years to measure changes, particularly in response to things like climate change or social shifts? I mean, repeating the study is what he says.
I think that's a wonderful idea for another researcher to do. The survey instrument is there and available if you want to do comparisons later. This was a 3-year project, and I have other projects that I'm working on now, so I'm unlikely to go back in time. But one thing to be said about that is I was able to do analyses based both on the Druid birth decade and the time practicing Druidry, so I could tease out how things have changed over time in Druidry and separate that from the age issue, right, or the amount of practice. And what was interesting to me is, aside from a couple of small things like in the modern age, more druids get their information about druidry through the internet, and it used to be more face-to-face interactions or pamphlets. That's changed. Most of the actual beliefs and the ritual practices and devotional practices and all of that has stayed pretty much constant across time. So I didn't see substantial variation of a kind that I think if you do this in 10 or 15 years, it will make a difference. I don't see that. I saw the amount of internet connection was a thing. Yeah, I'm not sure. There were 1 or 2 small things, but they were things that, like, the whole world has changed in this way because of technology, but it wasn't really the spiritual part changing all that much.
Okay, thanks, Larisa. Mark has a question. Does any of the data suggest druids using traditional holidays they already knew well from upbringing, like using winter solstice and Christmas, as interchangeable?
Many druids overlapped such things. So I didn't separate that clear. That wasn't clearly separated in the data. Some people talked about how they did both together, and there's quite a number. There's about 7% of druids. It's not a lot actually, but there's some that are Christian druids. There are Jewish druids. So they concurrently practice both religions, and so time-wise, they would be celebrating both when they correspond. But not necessarily in the same ritual. So that would be hard to tease out from the data that I have.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth has a question. Did you ask any questions on social acceptance of druid ways in their countries and locations?
Huge. There's a whole chapter on it. Yeah, it talked about privacy and safety concerns. It talked about the context. It talks about how druids actually change depending on the social environment and how safe they feel and how accessible nature is, they actually change the way they perform their rituals and change the nature of their practice based on those things. There's quite significant variations. Most of it in the United States is one of the worst places to practice druidry. Brazil was another one where people were very fearful. Britain was the best place by far to be able to safely and openly practice druidry. But in many parts of the world, it's actually a big deal. People lose access to their children, they lose jobs, it's really kind of scary. So there's a lot, but I can't really give the whole. It's not a one minute response, I'm afraid.
Of course not. I mean, as soon as it's a lot to unpack. We just have time for one more question. This is Andrew. Are Druids mostly of European heritage ancestry? Do we know how local non-European peoples feel about Druids incorporating local traditions into Druidic practice?
Two questions. One is the connections to what I call Celtic culture, and I didn't define it. I was allowing Druids to self-define. Of the number of Druids that wrote in, there are about 11% that have no genealogical ties of any kind, and have never visited, have never been to any, European, formerly Celtic area. The majority of people have a family heritage that in some way derives from Europe, but many of them had never visited, never had any experience with the actual modern culture there, right? So they have a genealogical connection, but not a cultural connection. And 23% were sort of born and raised in Europe. That answers the question. There was another piece to that. I'm sorry.
How do we know how local non-European peoples feel about Druids incorporating local traditions into Druidic practice?
I didn't interview or survey any of the local indigenous peoples, but I do have this. There was a lot of discussion of those who integrated some local indigenous. It's not that they didn't so much incorporate the indigenous traditions, but they looked at the indigenous myths and they looked at the indigenous plant lore to understand what was important in their local environment. And many of them actually wrote extensively on the steps they took to avoid appropriating, misusing local holy sites or misusing traditional rituals in any way. But there was another set of Druids who, interestingly enough, are either entirely or in part have genetic descent from indigenous peoples, especially in the United States and Canada. And there's a big thing here about the amount of blood that you have linked to a particular tribe, keeping you in or out of officially being accepted in that tribe. So some of these people were finding a home in Druidry because it had a similar spiritual connection to the land while being open to them, because they might be only 25% bloodline, and so were excluded from their own heritage for that reason. So, and those people didn't have any qualms about grabbing bits from their own heritage and using it in combination. So there were those sort of two threads.
This is fascinating, and unfortunately, if we have to end this piece now, where can people contact you? Because I know there was one question, and apologies, I didn't write it. It's about your methodology. Do you have a web? Can I give your
Yes.
Could you type while I'm just getting them? When I'm getting the breakout rooms, would you type in your email address if you're happy to have people ask you questions or contact you further?
Whiteboard. I'm not. Where is? Oh, here's
the chat is over on the left.
So if people go to my website, it's larisa-a-white.com. You can message me from there, but I'll put something in the chat as well.
And if you put it in now before we break it out, because it won't be available in the breakout rooms.
If you go to the breakout rooms, it will. Oh, here we go. Everyone's. So So that's the website, and you can reach me at there you go. So website and
Wonderful. So for those of you who are new to Zoom, because I know we had some newbies last week, a number will come up with say join such and such a room. Just click on that and I'll stay out here in the main room to help people get through. So listen, it's a social chat. Just introduce yourselves and get to know each other. Okay, that'll be 15 minutes. We'll be back again at 8 o'clock to hear our next speaker, Dana. Okay.
Emer.
I'll go ahead and share my screen.
We're just waiting for people to come back.
Grab that link.
Yeah, people are coming in now.
Stop sharing for a minute. I gotta grab that link. I had it, but I think I have the old.
So just making sure is everybody back. Great. So welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed meeting some new people or maybe meeting people you've already met before. So this starts the second part of our evening this evening. And this is Dana Driscoll. You're Driscoll, Dana, is it?
Oh yeah, so I am
Driscoll
in the Druid community because I publish in my field as well. I've got like 70 some academic peer-reviewed publications. So I use Dana Driscoll there and Dana O'Driscoll. I'm not trying to hide, I'm just trying to distinguish being a
because I
Druid
saw
versus
both
being a
forms.
scholar. Yeah.
I saw both forms and I was wondering, which was.
They're both true. They're all the things are true.
Okay, Dana. So anyway, just to welcome Dana, and the title of her paper is Channeling the Awen Within, an exploratory study of the Bardic arts in the modern Druid tradition. So over to you, Dana, and she's put a link in the chat for everybody to see.
So the link in the chat just has a link to this PowerPoint as well as a link to the original Mount Haemus piece. And there's also a link to the peer-reviewed article. And then I also just included some additional resources on that page. So thank you so much, Emer. I'm really excited to be here and really delighted to be sharing this. So I was the 19th Mount Haemus scholar, and this piece was produced in, I want to say this came out in 2019. So it's been a bit. In addition to being a Druid grade member of OBOD, I am also the Grand Archdruid and a Lave Adept in the Ancient Order of Druids in America. And I am a professor at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And I do write at the Druids Garden. So I just want to actually start for a minute by giving you a chance, and you can put this in the chat or reflect how you want. I want to give you a minute to just think about, what do the Bardic arts mean to you? And when's the last time you experienced the flow of Awen? So just take a moment, reflect. If you want to share, you're welcome to share. And if not, that's okay. I'll just give you a moment or two to do that. Okay. So thinking about the Bardic arts and the Awen is really at the heart of what this presentation is about. Basically, I'm going to be covering four questions from the data and then a fifth question. Thinking about, what do the Bardic arts look like in the modern Druid tradition? how are people connecting to the spiritual side of the Bardic arts? How does community support the Bardic arts, and what cultural challenges may prevent people from becoming bards? And then sort of once we get to the end of this presentation is how can you start, deepen, or explore your own Bardic arts and connection with the Awin? And I've already given you the link that's here. And I already see some wonderful things coming into the chat. Sounds like some people recently experienced music and painting boxes, and fantastic. And Suzanne, yes, Suzanne's saying in the chat, I think this is really what makes druidry different from other pagan and spiritual traditions, and I completely agree. So a little bit about me. I'm a druid. I've been a druid almost 20 years. I'm an animist bioregional druid. I live in the Laurel Highlands of Western Pennsylvania. I live on a 5-acre farm where we are practicing both permaculture and sort of traditional homesteading, as well as forest restoration, and herbalism and all sorts of things. And as a scholar, I am a learning researcher. I'm the author of about 65 peer-reviewed articles, as well as a book. And so I'm coming at this project both as a druid and as a scholar. And in my professional life, I study writing development and longitudinal learning development. And I also recently started studying flow states. And as a bard, I'm a visual artist. I've been an artist all of my life. All of the paintings that you see in this presentation come from my own body of work. I primarily work in watercolor, leatherwork, botanical illustration, and natural arts. So some of you may have seen some of my oracles or tarot decks. I also am a writer. I just had a book come out a couple of months ago, and actually it's coming out in the UK in about a week, called Land Healing through Red Feather. And I'm also the author of Sacred Actions and the Sacred Actions Journal. And I play music. So I sort of brought all those things together, being a bard, being a druid, and being a scholar to think about this project. So let's start with Bardic arts and the druid tradition. When I took on this project, we really only had one piece of scholarship, which was another Mount Haemus piece. There was no other writing on the Bardic arts, particularly from a social science perspective. So Letcher's 2009 Mount Haemus piece examined sort of the role of the ancient bards from a historical context, and really framed bards in terms of professionals who perform stories and music and poetry, and so on. But we sort of have the modern Bardic arts and the movement, and we're seeing that sort of in a lot of different ways in the Druid tradition. People who take up creative practices as part of Druid spirituality, and this can really be any creative expressions, and we've seen a lot of people really expanding the idea of what is the Bardic arts. So at the time that I did this research, we had very few empirical studies on the modern Druid tradition, and I think that Larisa's study you just saw is by far the most robust that has ever existed. Here are some others, and I'll note that more than half of these people are Obad Druids. These names here I have here, like Kim Kerner's work. There were no studies on the Bardic arts prior to this work. So the framework I'm coming from, I actually feel like I need to say less about this because Larisa and I are coming from the same framework, where we're thinking about this from a social science standpoint, where we are collecting systematic observations about the world, analyzing data in a systematic way and drawing conclusions, employing qualitative, quantitative approaches. And for me, as a learning researcher, my real goal is always to think about how people learn and how people develop, how people go from being a novice to being an expert in a particular craft. And so you'll see that angle on what I'm presenting here. So to move into my specific study, I used survey and interview methods predominantly. I did surveys where I developed a survey and shared it with OBOD, AODA, and a variety of other Druid groups and social media listservs and groups. And the goal of the survey was to have a broad understanding about the kinds of Bardic practices that people were engaging in, what struggles they had, how they got into be a bard, and all of those things. And then I used criterion-based sampling to do follow-up interviews. And these were done 60 to 90 minutes via Zoom. And criterion-based sampling means that I selected people very specifically to represent different regions, to represent different Bardic practices, to represent different social and demographic characteristics, and also to represent different levels of expertise. I wanted some people who were really new in the Bardic arts and other people who had been practicing for a long time. I did a systematic content analysis to explore themes and patterns. And I also did something called member checking, where after I analyzed the data and I had a draft, I sent it to all the people that I interviewed to make sure that I was accurately representing their experience. And for those of you who are in the United States, because I am a scholar, I'm a professional scholar, I did undergo ethics research review, which is called an IRB, through Indiana University of Pennsylvania. So just noting that for people who might know and care. Okay, so let's talk about the study. I had 266 druids from 9 different countries. The majority of those were OBOD members, including 64% bards, 21% ovates, and 14% druids. And then I had 61 participants that belonged to other druid orders, and some of those belonged to multiple druid orders, because a lot of us do. And then I did the interviews with the 14 druids. And overall, now one thing I'll say is that when I sent out a Bardic study, a study on the Bardic arts, I got people who do the Bardic arts. So that's the big limitation of the study, is that I would have loved to talk to more people who did not participate or did not think that they are much of a bard, or they don't have a sort of a spiritual creative practice. So you can see 98% of them felt the Bardic arts were important in their spiritual practice. 72.6% regularly practice the Bardic arts, with 57.6% practicing each week. And 46% considered themselves to be an expert in at least one Bardic art. So that's sort of the overview general pattern. So now I'm going to sort of cover 4 different areas that came out of the study. And again, as Larisa has already said, these are not my opinions. This is my interpretation of the data that I gathered. And for each of these, I also have sort of a reflective piece for you. So the first piece is, how do people develop Bardic practices in the context of Druid spirituality, and what are the trajectories for them engaging with the Bardic arts? So you might think about, does any of these 3 I'm going to share describe you? So the first group of people, if we think about how do you engage with the Bardic arts, the first group of people actually never had a creative practice prior to finding Druidry. And they were often seeing themselves as very uncreative, or having no creativity, or just, I'm not a creative person. But then whenever they joined the Druid tradition, and they joined OBOD or another Druid order, or they joined a Druid grove, they started to explore that, because that's obviously part of our tradition. So Mark from the US is a really nice example of this. Mark's an accountant. And he really said, I was never anything. I never saw myself as creative. And then suddenly he began he joined a grove that had a regular Eisteddfod, and then he began really getting into this. So he says, to me, they are almost intertwined, and they can't be separated now. Those poems that are written, I'm realizing that's definitely part of my spirit coming out. So while Mark had no creative practices prior to Druidry, now he has a creative practice. So that's sort of the first path that people come into. The second path is probably, to me, in some ways, the most joyful path, because these are folks that had a previous creative practice. Many of them had professional practices, and they set those aside for some reason. So maybe they were a professional actor or a professional musician, and that was sort of like, that was another life, right? And then suddenly they enter Druidry, and they're like, oh no, what is this, right? And the transformation of Druidry over time allowed them to rediscover, to reframe, or rebuild their love of the creative arts. But that new creative practice is different in some way. So I have this extended quote, but I think it's really nice. So Nicole says, at 38, I discovered this thing called OBOD. And the first thing in the coursework is the creativity, spirituality, and Bardic journey. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to go and be that person again, that person I left at 27 years old, so that I can obtain some sort of spiritual enlightenment. I hadn't sung in 15 or 20 years. I picked up the buffalo drum. It's one of the most simple instruments you can play, and I started singing, and what came out of my mouth was angry and heartbroken and poignant. I was crying. It was amazing. And then I started realizing that my particular expression, which tied to my spirituality, is to use all this knowledge and training to express myself in that form that is true to myself, not as an imitation to be a classical artist. And once I realized it, I don't have to make a perfect sound. I can make whatever sound that won't come out of me that day, and that was valid. That was a revelation to me, to pursue the creative endeavor without judgment. And one of the things that Nicole's quote really speaks to, which I'm going to get into further, is sort of the difference between seeing the creative practices as an end goal to make a product or to produce something, versus having the creative practices as a spiritual practice. And that's a thing that we're going to see again and again. So that's path 2. Path 3. Maybe you already had a creative practice prior to finding druidry. And maybe, like me, the reason that you wanted to be a druid as opposed to another pagan tradition is because we had this thing called the Awen and the Bardic arts, and it was super cool. So for these folks coming into druidry, they're coming in with an existing creative practice, which might be professional or personal, and then they're learning about how to build a connection spiritually. A lot of these folks in their data, they talked a lot about shifting their practices into being more in service to the living earth or to connecting to the earth. So Oliver's a nice example here. He says, I've always been an artist, but now I'm an artist with spirit. Learning about the Awen has allowed me to explore a whole new side to my creativity. So those are the three paths, and maybe you see yourself in one of them, and maybe there's a path that might be different for you. So now that we've gotten a sense of how do people come into the Bardic practices from outside of druidry, what impact do those Bardic practices have on the lives of druids? And again, you might consider, how do these experiences match your own? So once the Bardic practice is established for many, many people in my study, like we're talking over 90%, this becomes a critical and central focus of a druid's spiritual life. And people talked about it as nurturing their souls, giving them balance, supporting their mental health. So we have Thania from Canada who says, my Bardic art is vital to my life. I would dwindle and die if I couldn't dance. And I'm always happier when I find time to paint. So the Bardic arts are so critical for druids in the study. And they're really deeply interwoven with other druid practices such as ovate and druid paths. And I have an example here. This is a painting that I did of a mushroom that lives on our land. It's the Amanita muscaria vargasoi, which is the red fly agaric mushroom. This is our North American version. And I actually studied this extensively as an ovate and then chose to paint it as a bard. So I think that's a nice example of how we sort of integrate those practices and tie them to life. Here's another example of sort of this primary conduit for spiritual practice piece. So Jason says, poetry for me is both prayer and spell work in addition to art. I glean not just satisfaction and enjoyment from it, but I learn from it. I learn how to live. I learn how to look at the woods and listen to the trees. My Bardic art in terms of poetry is part of the world. It is the foundation of what I'm doing spiritually. And Bob, who is a woodworker, says, Bardic art connects me to spirit in ways not easily describable. I see the natural materials I use as a gift from spirit to be shaped and finished to bring the true beauty of nature itself. So we can really see how important and deep these practices are for bards. Of course, we have to talk about the Awen. So I asked participants, every participant, both the survey and the interview participants, a lot about the Awen, and we spent a great deal of time. And I can talk a lot more about the Awen. But for the majority of participants, Awen is seen as a mystical and uncontrollable thing in the sense that you are not sure when or how it will flow, but you can consciously make yourself a worthy vessel, which this is a term I heard a lot in the study. I want to make sure that I am prepared for when the Awen happens. So a lot of people talked about conscious engagement with the Awen, preparation with the Awen through a variety of spiritual practices. And this can be on both the individual and the group level. So on the individual level, it might be things like meditation, just practicing in an open grove, creating sacred space and creating space and time generally, using rituals, chanting Awen, going into nature. But also for groups, it could be Istedfod, working with others on creative practices and supporting practices. So the idea for many is like, when the Awen is flowing, I want to fully honor the Awen, which was there. And I think this quote is a really nice example of the ways in which druids were talking about it. So Adam says, it's not something you can bargain for or ask for. It's just every so often you're open in the right way and you're the right time and a sense of inspiration is able to flow. I think the power of Amen is always there. I think that one's openness to it and one's ability to move into it consciously that waxes and wanes. It comes and goes, not necessarily on a predictable cycle. If we're too busy, if our minds are too full, we're too anxious, it's hard for that to come in and offer creativity, direction, or inspiration. But that's not to say it can't and it might break through. All right, so we talked about how people get into the Bardic arts and some conceptualizations about spirituality and Awen. So what about the community in the Bardic arts? And you might think about, how has the community that you have around you supported your own creative expressions? So one of the major things that came out of the study was how important Istedfod was for people who practiced it. Eisteddfod appeared in many different forms in the Druid community. The most common were either with small groups of friends or groves, and also at larger Druid gatherings. And the formats changed pretty significantly depending on how long a group had been together, how established they were, and so on. So the most common one was a bardic circle where people share their creative offerings. That might be in someone's living room around the fire. And that might even be with a lot of non-druids. So some druids were organizing these bardic circles for their friends that would come and play music. And some of the friends didn't even know they were a druid and they were just playing music. But to the druid, they were organizing this. Others were in small groups or groves. And generally the larger, more established groves, and of course the Druid gatherings, had the more formal Eisteddfod competition where people sign up, they have prizes and so on. And here's a way that one of my participants described Eisteddfod. It's a part of our legacy, inheriting this Druid thing. I think it rounds out the spiritual experience in a very profound way, an outward way. A lot of what we consider spiritual is inward, even private. And when we are in a group ritual, most of the time are looking inward, not outward. Here is something that is outward facing and is expressive. And just to give you a sense of the power of Eisteddfod, I'm going to turn to Loam, who was attending the East Coast gathering. And right before the East Coast gathering, as she described to me in her interview, she was really feeling that her creative practices were in a really bad place. And she actually said, I'm thinking about burning everything I've ever written. So Loam is a poet and Loam is a musician. So while she is at the Druid gathering, she sits around and starts joking around about stinging nettles, because some druid had ran through a patch of stinging nettles and they had gotten stung, and they were laughing and talking about it. And from this conversation, that she wrote a song that afternoon, the Awen flowed through her, and then she sang that song that night and she won the Eisteddfod. And so here's what Loam shares. When that song won the Eisteddfod, there was a weight to it. That song was community source. Relationship with people in your community builds relationship with your art. That was the message from the gods I was getting. Get home, do some work, but don't hole up. Find your community, connect, play, and have fun. Stop waiting for things to be perfect. If you're sequestered all on your own, how are you going to be inspired? And if you must throw your work in the fire, throw it into the fire of community. So I think that really gives a nice sense of what these Eisteddfod, and this is just one of many examples I had for people who had an opportunity to participate in Eisteddfod, what it really did for people. The last piece of data I'm going to share is the challenges that bards face, or new bards face. So you might ask yourself, well, what has prevented you from engaging in more bardic arts or from taking up the path of a bard? So it's sort of interesting because on one hand, we have this Druid tradition that's really an amazing place for people to explore sacred creativity, to explore how to be a bard and how to connect with the flow of Awen. But we also live in cultures where there are lots of challenges that sort of prevent us from being creative. So there were a lot of reasons. Only a minority of the participants in my study, like less than 20%, talked about not taking up a creative practice, because I really got most of the people who were most excited, which is selection bias, which happens. But people say, oh, I'm not talented, or they have a fear of failure. They lack time. They lack access to what they need to be creative. Maybe you need an instrument that you can't afford. Or people have previous trauma surrounding creative practices, which might be like parents or teachers or family members or loved ones. It's often people that are close to them that pretty much like discourage creativity. I can talk about all of these, but I'm going to actually talk about the myth of talent, because I think this is the one that was most pervasive for our bards. The idea of talent is, and I call this a myth because it is a myth, and I am a learning researcher, and I've published widely on how people learn over time, and I can tell you for certain that from my expertise, the talent is a myth. The idea of talent implies that you're either good at something or you're not, that it's an innate quality that people possess. And it also implies that you should be good at something the very first time you try it, right? Both of which are just like lies, right? They're just not true. But there's also like this inherent sort of capitalist narrative that my participants talked about that lumps some people like you're either part of the creatives or you're not, with the goal of the creatives being people who commodify their work and sort of sell it, right? So you're the good enough to sell it or you're not. And so Dave talks about this, and he says, when I was at school, basically, if you weren't into cricket or football or hockey and good at them, then you were no good. Or at art, if you weren't good at clay, sculpting, or drawing by the age of 8 or 10, then you were no good and forget about it. And a lot of people have these kinds of narratives. And some people are able to overcome them. And for some people, these things are really stifling. But the truth is that talent is a myth. All people can become competent and skilled if they work hard. And many bards in the study described like the intense amount of practice and hard effort that they put into their practice to be successful. And that is really, I think, an important takeaway here. Oops, sorry. So one of the things we can think about in terms of this is how do you shift your mindset away from these cultural narratives? So Rebecca, who's from Australia, as a new bard, talks about this. She says, I think that overcoming my own negative mindset as far as the arts are concerned is critical. I was feeling like I wasn't doing it correctly or as perfect as possible. That was my biggest push to dropping my arts practices in the first place. I was like, it's not good enough, so why try? So now I'm trying to enjoy my creating, not worrying about the end outcome, getting more out of it personally, trying to embrace the process, not worrying about making it perfect for a viewer and for myself, looking at it with a non-judgmental eye. So what we're seeing here is there's a learning theory called growth mindset, which ties to all this talent stuff, right? And this theory says, listen, nobody is good at something the first time they try it. Mistakes are actually a natural part of learning. And the thing we can do is practice, practice, practice. And we have a quote here from Robert that says, I think the most important anything can do about any bardic art is to pursue some training and practice, do it every day. You cannot learn bardic skills through osmosis. So really sort of reorienting this myth of talent in our minds can be really successful. And I have lots of other things to say, but hey, we've got 5 minutes left. So just sort of to summarize these findings, individuals who are joining the Druid tradition find the bardic arts typically by one of those 3 paths. Many individuals who practice the bardic arts see them as integral and sacred in their lives, helping to achieve balance, sanity, and purpose. The Awin is a mystical, uncontrollable force, and yet one that we can tap into and work with. And it's really cultivating that Awin is really central to the spiritual practices of many participants. And our communities can support each other in the bardic arts, particularly through Eisteddfod. And we need to fight against those cultural challenges and really thinking about our creativity and our bardic practices as a spiritual practice rather than some kind of commodified product. So I'm just going to sort of end this talk with a bit of takeaways for Druids and really thinking about how do we sort of embrace this path of the bard and help others do the same. So I think through this study, what I really took away is just how impressive and interesting and unique our particular emphasis on the bardic arts and the Druid tradition they are compared to other spiritual traditions, and just how meaningful they are to so many people. These are really a core aspect of our practice, and bards in our tradition are best when they emphasize the creative process, the connection to Awin, the spirituality, and not so much like, is it good? How, would people like it? Like, that's not really, and here's the thing, many very competent bards focus on process. And in the end, you still get the product, like, but by focusing on that process rather than that product, by focusing on that spiritual practice, that really allows us to do that. And of course, the idea that we are doing these things in a supportive community where there's no judgment, and it doesn't matter how good you are when you get up to perform or share your work. So some suggestions for new or hesitant bards is we do want to avoid these cultural challenges like the myth of talent. Just ignore that. Just don't even pay attention to that. Internalize capitalism, saying that you should do something that is commercial value. Don't do any of that. Or having that negative reinforcement. And there were a lot of stories in the study where people had those things. They came into Druidry. They gave the creative practices a next step. And then from there, they were able to sort of break free of these and then have this extremely meaningful thing. Another thing for those that are new is to find a community. That is really important. And then don't be afraid to explore. For those of us who are already practicing the Druid or the Druid path, and maybe we already have a bardic practice, here are some suggestions. Work to intentionally cultivate the Awin. So you can do things like, I have this back here. You can't really see it very well, but that's my Awin altar. So I'm actually in my art studio as I'm presenting this to you. I have my Awin altar going, talking about the Awin. And so I actually go, I chant Awins, I light candles, I open up a sacred space. So I actually ritualize my practice. So you can actually try to, find different ways of using our tools within our tradition to intentionally cultivate the Awin and build a more sacred sense of it. But also like use your ovate path, right? So go out into the land and see what the land has to offer you. Take your creative tools out into nature. Connect to the local spirits of place. This painting here, actually, I painted this winter, and this is a mushroom that grows year-round called the witch's butter. And I love her. And I met her, and I met the spirit of her. And she gave me this painting. And she's like, would you please depict me in this way? And I was like, sure. So this is a great example of me going out into the land with my sketchbook, meeting a really cool mushroom, and then sort of bringing that into my practice. And really just, I think a lot of this is taking the time and being willing to, cultivate your creative skills, being a more worthy vessel. So that's what I have for you. Thank you very much. And I'm excited to hear your questions. And I'm also going to stop sharing.
Wow. Dana, that was wonderful. And I have one question in the chat. So many comments about you were speaking to so many people. So many people, yes, that's me, and then little bits of chat. So really, really interesting. Lots of comments about your artwork. Somebody, this is one capitalist question. Do you sell your artwork? That was a question earlier.
On my website.
Okay, go to the website.
Not much, but sometimes.
Okay.
Really, my art is really my spiritual practice. So I have some decks and things, but most of my art is done in service to my community.
Oh, beautiful.
So you can find some of it, but I mean, most of these pieces were done in service to the community or given away as gifts.
Wonderful. A question from Sean. This is more work for you, but you're a scholar, you love it. Have you considered doing a similar study for the expressions ovate work and druid work?
I mean, I certainly could. The nice thing is in the United States, I a couple of years ago got this thing called full professor, which pretty much means I'm open in terms of research. So I definitely think it would be really, it might be really interesting to look at the different practices. And I actually am doing a study, looking at a sort of an ovate style study, with a colleague of mine that I met at John C. Campbell, which is a folk school, and we're actually looking at like how people take up nature-oriented regenerative practices, which isn't specific to the Druid tradition, but I definitely think that there's room for more. And I mean, I love data. I love collecting data and research. So definitely. And if I don't do it, someone else can. I think there is so much possibility for just using these kinds of social science empirical methods to study our tradition, and so we can understand it better. And I mean, I have been a bard for, like I said, most of my life. And I learned a great deal, I learned a great deal about people that weren't me, right, doing these practices. So it was really nice to think about that.
Now, that's the only question I have. There are lots of comments, just loving it. Miriam says, this is a great talk. Thanks for this great talk. We should disseminate this so people can learn from it. And Sean, who asked the question, it's a thing in itself, the druidry has become big and varied enough to be able to study.
Yeah,
so
it's so true.
Lots of positive comments rather than questions. So any questions? We have a few more minutes that if anyone has, you could raise your hand if you don't want to type it in. Yeah, Philip, I'll let you in now, Philip. You can unmute yourself.
Thank you so much, Ema. And thank you so much, Dana, for that talk. That was absolutely tremendous. And one detail that you brought out in your paper that you didn't mention here, which I think is really worth picking out, is the way that within Druidry itself, there's been an evolution or a change, if you like, in as much as in earlier forms of Druidry and still in Welsh Druidry, in traditional Druidry in Wales, the product is very important. And there's an emphasis on the product in the, the traditional Eisteddfod, where there are prizes given for the best. And whereas in modern Druidry and in Obod in particular, we really focus on the process and take the emphasis away from the best, which I think is such an inhibiting concept, really. But over to you.
Yeah. So I did talk about that. I mean, I only had 25 minutes, so I had to decide what I was going to talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I do think like it's interesting because the only time we really saw that traditional competition kind of stuff was at the bigger Druid gatherings. But even at the bigger Druid gatherings where there was competition, there was also places for sort of nurturing and support that didn't require that kind of thing. And I do think that is it seems like it's a growing thing, because I think if we only have this idea of who is the best, then in some ways we're reinforcing some of these cultural narratives that are particularly problematic and that prevent people from, taking up the path of the bard at all. But if we're able to sort of create really safe spaces, and I've witnessed this a lot in our own Druid Grove, where we have people who have never been in front of an audience, they've never written a poem, they've never done any of that, and then they watch 2 or 3 events where everyone is sharing, and then suddenly they're willing to step up. I mean, and that's really even the example of Mark I shared. And so creating, I think it's really critical that those of us who are running groves or have small groups or running gatherings to really think about how do we really cultivate safe spaces for people to take the first few steps into sharing something, and creating these sort of nurturing spaces, and recognizing that there are places for novices in our community. There are places for the very beginner who hasn't been doing this for 20 years. And I think the other piece of that is like, people like me, like I have a blog post on my blog that actually like maps out my artistic journey and how like all of the work I did to get where I'm at, but starts with like, here's where I started and here's what my paintings looked like. And now here's where I'm at, right? Recognizing that we're all on that learning journey. And I do think that that's one of the most beautiful pieces of our tradition is that idea that we are coming together in community and we're supporting each other and supporting our learning and growth in many different ways. So absolutely.
So what, for the summer gathering, actually, I'm facilitating a poetry session on the Sunday morning. It's to get reluctant poets in a safe place to create some work, because I'm not a poet, I'm a storyteller. And I find it really, really intimidating. But I've learned this, and actually it's very, very freeing. Also, in addition, we have an open mic on the Sunday night if any of you are coming. And that again is to encourage people to start in a safe place. They don't have to have a high standard. It's look at, I can sing or play with my guitar or whatever it is, recite some poetry. And it's to showcase that in a safe place. So we're working on that as well, is to get people to do that. And I know my grove here for 20 years, we have a night court. That's what we call the Eisteddfod here. And it's been around watching people. And like you say, the first few times people go, no, no, no. And then they might recite someone else's poetry. And then gradually, just because the environment is there, that there's encouragement there. It's not about excellence. It's about you expressing yourself.
Yeah. And I think that's just so critical. And to really think about how do we create these safe spaces? How do we encourage people? And another thing I do is like, anytime I'm at, I don't know what you call it in the UK, but here it's like a garage sale or a yard sale. So when people put their stuff out for sale, I buy whatever art supplies I can and keep and hold on to them. And then when somebody expresses interest, I have supplies to give them, it's like, oh, why don't you try these paints? Oh, come and, so I think there's lots of ways that people that are, that have been doing some of these practices longer can really create open and safe spaces for people that are new. And I think that's really important. I do see another question in the chat. Do you want me to take
one? Any tips for the fear of making mistakes and not feeling good enough when it hits? I get so frustrated with things like drumming and end up not even trying, though I'm happier singing or crafting quietly.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple of pieces to this, right? So I think you have to say, there are, I said there's the myth of talent, but I do think that there are things that we gravitate towards that we really enjoy. And sometimes it takes a while to find the bardic art that really sings to our soul. And so one of the things I encourage new bards to do, or even people that have been doing it for a while, is to be a dabbler for a while. Try a number of different things. Don't give it like 1 hour, give it like 20 hours, give it enough time that you will have you'll build some knowledge, you'll get past the initial like frustrating, beginner stage, and then really see if you want to do it. And if it turns out it's not so great for you, that's okay. Pick up something else and keep trying things. Another piece of this is that I have dyslexia. So I've also found that there are certain art forms that I can do, but that frustrate me to no extent because, the neurodivergence in my brain. So like, I don't do fiber arts. I can't do fiber arts, all that counting and stitching, like people that do like all the like the crochet and all of those things. Like I've tried them repeatedly and I'm like, oh, these are just not for me. Right. So I think it's also okay to say there are certain art forms that maybe aren't for you. And people in my study talked about that. So, find the thing that sings to you. Recognize you can have multiple bardic arts, and recognize that just like anything else, we go through seasons in the wheel of the year. You know, sometimes my music is in the Yule, at Yule, it's at winter solstice, it's fallow, and that's okay. Now I'm picking it back up, right? But I think in terms of like to the fear of not making mistakes and not feeling good enough, a lot of that has to do with this. You know, I talked a little bit about Carol Dweck's work, right? And this idea of mindset. Part of this is really cultivating a sense of who we are and creating a safe space for us to make mistakes. One of the problems we have right now is that everything is on social media. It's like you have to have an Instagram, you have to have Facebook, you're sharing everything. That is, for a new bard, a really bad idea. Like, find people that support you and share it if you must. But the idea that you have to like share everything you're doing with the whole world, I think, is a problem, because people are like, oh, that's not good. Oh, you know, I could do better than that. You see that kind of stuff on social media. So that's one thing I would say, like, sort of a modern issue. But the other thing is, like, create a space for yourself to fail, to not be successful, to be messy. You know, nothing has, and the idea that you are engaging in the same way that there's a, you are, when you go into the sacred grove and into our inner grove, or you go and you do a ritual and maybe you make a mistake and you laugh about it, right? It's not a big deal. And sort of the more that you can sort of orient your own mind to recognizing, okay, it's really a problem with me, right? It's a problem with me thinking, oh, you know, I need to be perfect. Just going back to that quote we heard. So create a space for you to be able to learn and grow. And another thing that my parents are both artists, and they taught me, you know, you're working on this beautiful painting, and then suddenly you drop like a big blot of ink. It's like, all right, well, what are you gonna do with that? You don't give up in frustration, like figure out a way to make it weird and start playing with. So I think there's a lot that you can do, and also just surround yourself with people who are nurturing and supportive, not people who are detrimental, because there's nothing worse than somebody in your life, especially a close somebody like a relative or, you know, a partner who's constantly disparaging you. Like, that's just not, you know, so you really need to think about, how do I create a space for me to do this work in the best way possible, in a way that I'm not judgmental, and that practicing that non-judgment kind of stance. All of those things are suggestions I have.
Right. Last comment from Jem. Wonderful talks, raise many questions for me. If you've found your way to the Druid Hearth, please come and join our circle of OBOD academics, Dana and Larissa. I'd love to explore some of your ideas there. So that's a newly created circle on the Hearth. Okay, I mean, lovely comments. I think we need to get into our groups. It's been absolutely wonderful, and such a positive response to your presentation, Dana. So in your groups, again, it can be getting to know each other, or discussing how it was, you know, what came up for you during those either of the two presentations. So again, I'm just going to just click on the number that's there. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your chat rooms. We had a very, very interesting one. So I'm just waiting for everybody to come back now. Great. So, so this comes to the end of our Mount Haemus, well, our second Mount Haemus event. So it's been wonderful. I want to thank sincerely both Larisa and Dana for really, really interesting, so embedded, you know, and immersed in what druidry is, and looking at it from two different aspects. Just brilliant, absolutely wonderful. And of course, judging from the response of the viewers here, it's been really, really positive. So what I would like, just before we end, just put into the chat, you know, just a reaction to this evening's session. And as Philip said, this will be available for those as a recording for it's going up in Heart Philip first, and then it'll go up on YouTube. Yeah. Yeah. So 2 great evenings of listening and meeting lovely humans, inspirational, great talks, thought-provoking, wonderful, great. Just wonderful comments, just lovely. Inspirational and empowering, that's lovely. Great learning, great people indeed. Inspired lots of new ideas in me. That's wonderful. This has fed my need for community and academic interest in druidry. Thank you to the speakers. Beautiful, great and informative. Wonderful. Really inspiring evening, thought-provoking. Thank you for holding this online. These are fascinating and have awakened much within me to think about and explore. Great talks, feeling very connected. Excellent talks, very inspirational. Great. Loved it. So absolutely wonderful. So Philip, you hang on. So I'm going to say good night to good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are and if you're listening to or watching a recording of this. Brilliant. So our in real one, if any of you can make it, will be on Saturday, the 5th of October in Glastonbury. The invitation hasn't yet gone out, and that'll be a ticketed event. So that a paid for one because we have to book a premises. So thank you all for turning up and looking forward to the next time we see you, be it an online ceremony or in real at our summer gathering or gatherings elsewhere. So in the meantime, slán go fóill.